Good afternoon, and thank you so much for being here, colleagues and friends, staff, students, and people who've come from outside UMass Boston. It was a very dramatic entrance today into UMass Boston. I had to go down to receive one of our speakers, and I almost got blown away. And I couldn't open the door to her car because the wind was just making it impossible for me to do that. So I thought, well, this is either a good omen or an ambiguous one. And I think, like a good literary scholar, I am going to go with the good omen, right? So welcome again. We are in the second event of our week-long events for the launch of the Honors College. For those of you who have been part of UMass Boston for a long time, you know that we've had an honors program here for many, many years, for over 20 years, in fact. But moving from a program to a college signals a very significant elevation of status, and what that means is the provost is going to give us lots of money. No. It does signal the campus's commitment to an honors education and an honors curriculum, and the promise that we are going to serve all of our students, the academically motivated, high-achieving students, and we will help them realize whatever their intellectual aspirations might be. So we are really excited for today's event. Yesterday, we celebrated our own faculty, our own UMass Boston faculty who have taught in the honors program. We had a faculty showcase yesterday where we featured a social scientist, an economist, a chemist, professor of chemistry, and also a medical humanist. And today, we have 3 distinguished guests from outside UMass Boston, but part of the very rich intellectual landscape of Boston. And we have one of our own very distinguished faculty members here. Before I introduce you to them, I just want to say that today's event, we were supposed to have started at 4, but you know what happened? We had a fire drill, and we were supposed to go till 5:30, so I think we've started about 15 or 20 minutes late, so just add 15 or 20 minutes at the other end, so we'll probably end at about 5:50 or so. I want to say as well that the Chancellor couldn't be here, and he sends his regrets. But we do have the Assistant Chancellor, Terry Mortimer, to speak on his behalf and to offer his welcome to our guests as well. Terry Mortimer, you know, has been part of this campus for a very long time. She has served in many capacities as Dean, as Vice Provost for Academic Support Services, now as Assistant Chancellor, and she's always been very, very deeply committed to our students and to our faculty. I count her as one of my strongest mentors, and she's taught me how to be wise and to temper my own impulsive nature. So, Dr. Mortimer?
Professor Srikanth might have tempered her own personal manners, but she has created earth, wind, fire, and everything to celebrate the establishment of the Honors College. And so I just want to acknowledge how important she's been in this whole development. Thank you, Rajani, for your introduction. And thank you as well for this initiative and helping to plan this week's wonderful series of events that's going to celebrate the Honors College. I'm very pleased. I want to just say good afternoon to everyone here. I'm so pleased to be here to offer my greetings on behalf of the Chancellor. He does really regret he's not here. If you know anything about our Chancellor, this is a momentous occasion for our college, for our university, the establishment of an honors college. The only reason I got this plum assignment is because I've had the pleasure of working with the Honors College over the year, first under Professor Monica McAlpin and now under Rajani Srikanth. So I'd like to just take one moment, since we've lost a little time. I'd like just one moment, first of all, to add my thanks to the speakers that have joined us today. I mean, it is luminaries and distinguished guests like yourselves that really helps our honor students understand the importance of topics like what it means to be human. I'd also like to recognize the honors committee, the whole community, the alumni, the faculty who have participated, the friends, because to have an honors college, it really does take everyone to participate, everyone to give their best efforts. And so again, I appreciate very much, as the Chancellor would do, everyone's efforts. And the staff, it is a favorite practice of the Chancellor. He knows that we faculty might look good, but we get to be on stage only because of the wonderful work that our colleagues, our staff do to help us present events like this. So I extend a special thank you to all of those who've helped to bring this in together. The recent elevation of the honors program to an honors college signifies our university's commitment to serving our most intellectually ambitious students. And we do have a lot of intellectually ambitious students here. This college offers tremendous opportunities for our students to distinguish themselves intellectually through a vibrant curriculum, which is open to all of our undergraduate majors. More profoundly, this honors college, it has quickly become a vehicle to engage students in complex problems, complex issues, in which they love to delve into those. They love to hear, especially our speakers that are going to speak on the topic today. So when our first class of honors college, that's a wonderful thing, when our first class of honors college graduates, they will do so as transformational leaders, helped through events like this, through the program, through the faculty that teach in it. Once again, I simply want to thank Dean Rajani Shrikant for all the work that she has done with this program, to the staff, and again to our speakers, who I am anxiously looking forward to listening to. So thank you again for honoring us with your presence here on our campus. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mortimer. And before I introduce our provost, who will also welcome you, I do want to take this moment to thank the Honors College staff. Our Associate Director, Dr. Megan Rokop, could you please stand up? Dr. Rokop is a professor of biology, and she teaches interdisciplinary courses that are focused on biology within the Honors College. I'd like to introduce Mike Metzger. Mike Metzger is behind, and he has been, in some ways, the orchestrator, the conductor of all of the events of this week. Thank you so much, Mike. Joyce Morrissey, our incomparable program coordinator and now Honors College coordinator. She's been associated with the Honors College the longest of all of us, I think for the last 25 years, Joyce? 20 years, okay. So let me just start by saying that, and yes, thank you. And I'd also like to give my thanks to Sarah Bolden. Sarah, would you please stand up? Sarah is a current student in the Honors College, and she is our first Honors College ambassador. And she's been incredibly, what shall we say, gracious in drumming up interest in the Honors College and recruiting students into the Honors College and in making our presence known on the campus. Thank you very much, Sarah. Sarah is a major in Latin American and Iberian studies. Did I get that right? Super, thank you. So before I turn it over to the provost for his remarks, I do want to say something about the Honors College curriculum. It is an interdisciplinary curriculum. We really do understand that creative thinking happens when students are able to make connections across seemingly disparate fields of knowledge. So this question of what does it mean to be human and what is uniquely human, we thought provided our faculty and our students the opportunity to wrestle with something really complex and intellectually rich. The course, we offered a course about 2 semesters ago, and I really want to acknowledge Ken Campbell, who is a professor in the biology department. Ken, would you please stand? It was his idea, he dreamed it up, and he invited a professor of English, not from our campus. She was a visiting scholar, originally from South Korea, and now she teaches at the Manhattan College in New York. But they met at one of these interesting international affairs events hosted by our Office of International and Transnational Affairs. And they discovered that they both had an interest in this question of what does it mean to be human. Ken from the perspective of biology, and Yoonga Kim from the perspective of literature and philosophy. So together they put together this course on what is human. And this semester we have Professor Daria Boninger, who's a professor of psychology, who's teaching the course. And her course is called Human Identity, Human Rights, and Human Nature. Am I getting that right? Okay. So you can see we really want to have our students engage with these issues, some very fundamental issues from many different disciplinary perspectives. And toward that end, we put together our panel. We have Dr. Richard Wrangham from Harvard University, who's a biological anthropologist. We have Dr. Julius Williams, well, Maestro Julius Williams, who's a professor of composition from the Berklee College of Music. And we have Dr. Lynn Stein Adair, did I get that right? Lynn Andrea Stein, sorry. Lynn Andrea Stein, who is a professor of cognitive science and computer science from the Olin College of Engineering. And we have our own very own Lloyd Schwartz, who is a professor of English, poet, and Pulitzer Prize-winning music critic. I'm going to give you more of their bios as they come forward, but let me now introduce our own provost. Provost Winston Langley is, as you know, devoted to UMass Boston. He was a professor of the political science department, and before that, as an undergraduate, he was a biology major. While he was a political science professor, he also acquired a law degree in human rights law. So he is intellectually, I like to call a polymath, someone who really knows and understands the connections among different fields of knowledge, and he is a champion of the kind of thinking that we feature within the Honors College. Professor Winston Langley and Provost Winston Langley.
Thank you, Rajni. I notice you use the past tense. In my professorship, am I to know something before I say anything here? Thank you for having me in your midst, and I hope you'll allow me to say that the Honors College at this university has had a long and distinguished career, first as a program. Last November, it was formally established as a college. And we think that this change is one that will enable it to carry out more effectively that which it has been so committed to. Among those many things that have shaped its commitment are, one, to ensure that the diversity about which we speak when we think of universities includes the diversity of challenges that students seek when they enter a university. Not all of us seek the same challenges in life, but when we enter university, it should in fact represent, among other things, the universe of challenges that human beings may encounter. And here the intellectual and emotional and psychological, etc., challenges that the college offers differ in many ways from what the university at large has to offer to its undergraduates. Reference is made to interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity as areas which we see as defining of the college. And we do so in ways to ensure that the multiple problems our societies face will be addressed from many different standpoints, but also that those who in fact are involved in this form of trans and interdisciplinarity will give expression to parts of themselves that may have lain somewhat dormant. A broad, organic, capacious encounters with subject areas of many kinds. Indeed, I think what we have this afternoon as part of our discussion, what does it mean to be human, lends itself to that form of discussion. One may say it is an intertemporal one. If one were asking the question 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, I think one may address it somewhat differently. We know, for example, that human beings seemingly went in the direction of tool making as a systematic matter after we began to walk upward. That perhaps symbolic communications came after a certain type of enlargement of the brain. And domestication of plants and animals may have followed thereafter also. It will be very interesting, therefore, as we listen to our distinguished colleagues this afternoon address this question, to see the different take from the different discipline and whether there might be an intertemporal feature to it. What I would like to say is this, that for the Honors College, not only did we say that the urban community of Greater Boston should be a laboratory that might be used by our students in reconciling the applied and the theoretical, but as well that the text of their own experience as human beings should not be subordinated to the text that we customarily associate with academic life, and that the linkage between these two, what it means to be human, is something that may be addressed as we seek to understand ourselves, the societies in which we find ourselves, the world of which we're a part, and indeed the world that we sometimes think we know but may not know very well, including the inner world of human beings. So I look forward to the engagement this afternoon and see this as a very important celebration of the coming into being of the college, since this question should represent one among many that should define its conversation as we deal with the broader conversations of human beings, since we have had some dawn of consciousness and since we aspire to something beyond what we see as current limitations. Thank you.
So we will now go directly into our program. Our first speaker is Dr. Richard Wrangham. He is the Ruth B. Moore Professor of Biological Anthropology at Harvard University. He studies chimpanzees and their behavior. His main interest in the question of, is in the question of human evolution from a behavioral perspective. He is the author of numerous publications, but among them is one titled Catching Fire: How Cooking Made Us Human. Dr. Wrangham and each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and we'll go from one to the next, at the end of which we then will have a closing by our own Dr. Lloyd Schwartz, and then we'll have a Q&A. Dr. Wrangham?
Vice Chancellor, Provost, distinguished guests, it's a great honor to be part of the Honors College celebration. We've been asked to talk about what it means to be human. Well, obviously, to being a thinking, feeling being, part of a social community is what makes us human. It doesn't matter that we are bipedal or that we are hairless. What matters is our brains, so let's talk about our brains. We have a big brain. Where does it come from? We know where it comes from. We look back 2 million years in the past. We can see from the sizes of skulls that our brains have grown pretty steadily over the last 1.9 or so million years. So then if we want to ask what it means to be human, where we got our brains from, then we have to go back into the past, and we can look at the species that are represented over the last 2 million years. We ourselves are Homo sapiens, represented here by the finest specimen ever known, the president of Harvard. Before us there was Homo heidelbergensis, which is really very similar to Homo sapiens. Really hardly any differences, as represented here by the president of Yale. And then before us, Homo erectus, which could still walk into a store on Main Street and buy clothes off the peg. But then we go to Australopithecus, which is more like a chimpanzee standing upright, the size of a chimpanzee with a small chimpanzee-sized brain and big jaws, and really a different species. So the story of our brains goes back to that point. Now, where do we go to understand a species adaptation? Well, if we go to other species, we go to what they eat. Fleas eat blood, dolphins fish. We can understand these species as adapted to what they eat. But what is it that humans are adapted to? What set the genus Homo on the path towards our big brains? The standard story is that we began eating lots of raw meat, whether scavenged or hunted. I have a number of problems with that. Maybe this symbolizes one of them. The animal on the left is one that eats a lot of raw meat. If you look at their teeth, they're rather different from the teeth that you can feel by swirling your tongue around your mouth. I'm not very keen on the raw meat idea for all sorts of reasons, but ultimately it goes back to my experience watching chimpanzees. I've spent some part of every year for the last almost 40 years watching chimpanzees in the wild. And I started out by studying their feeding behavior in order to understand what really makes a chimpanzee tick. So I ate everything that a chimpanzee eats. Well, almost everything. Anything that I thought would not actually make me physically sick. And so I can spend a day eating chimpanzee foods, and I discover that they are very fibrous and rather dry and rather toxic and not very sweet. And by the time I've done that, I've decided I don't want to be a chimpanzee after all. I want to come home and eat what has been prepared in the camp, which turns out to be cooked food. This got me thinking, being a bright young lad, about 25 years later, about the significance of cooked food. I was following in the footsteps of James Boswell, Samuel Johnson's amanuensis, who wrote that his definition of man was a cooking animal, and apparently in the coffee houses of the 18th century Britain, people had discovered the notion that humans are really special because we cook our food. And Darwin thought the same thing. Darwin had experience of being in the wild and having to live without fire and realizing how very difficult it is to do so for even a day. And he said that one of the most important things about humans is our ability to control fire. And yet, over the years, that idea has somehow died. People have paid not much attention to it. And I think the reason is this. He said that it was a discovery made by man. And I don't mean to accuse him of sexism. He might have meant woman. But the thing is that if you think that the discovery of the control of fire was made by humans, then it didn't do very much for us, because humans were already human. And people do tend to think that the discovery of fire was made by humans, because in this diagram representing 2 million years ago at the bottom and the present at the top, you see the spread of humans through most of the world. And you see represented only at the top really confident representations of the control of fire, because the archaeology fades as you go back into the past. And so once you get back to 200, 300, 400,000 years ago, there are very few people who will say confidently, yes, we can find fire here. And that means that we have fire discovered sometime between Sapiens and Heidelbergensis, and it didn't do very much to change humans. And yet, I had my experience with chimpanzees. I was worried about whether or not humans were really like other animals. Could we really survive on the foods eaten raw by our closest relatives? What about if we try and eat foods now? Every other animal eats its food raw, of course. We are unique in being a species everywhere we are, eating the great majority of our food cooked. And every other animal makes babies, cheerfully, on raw food. What about humans? In the best study we have of this, which is a study of German raw foodists living in their urban areas, eating raw food, it turns out that by the time women are eating 100% of their food raw, 50% of them are totally amenorrheic. They have lost the ability to have a baby, and so have a further 20%, because their ovarian system has got problems. They do not have enough energy to get their food. Now, what is really striking about this is that this is so despite the fact that this food is incredibly good quality compared to anything that a wild animal or a hunter-gatherer can eat. Because it's already been blended and ground, often in a food processor, which you don't find in the Paleolithic. It's often been dried up to 114 degrees Fahrenheit. It has all sorts of advantages in terms of being domesticated, not wild. People are including meat and oil in their diet. They are eating from the global food resource, so they don't go through periods of winters without very much food. And they're not taking much activity. And yet, it is the case that the average woman on this diet cannot have a baby. I think this means it's very clear. Humans are different from every other animal. It is not the case, as Levi-Strauss, the famous social anthropologist, said, that we cook our food in order to distinguish ourselves psychologically from the animals. We cook our food because otherwise we would die. We have evolved to be quite different species from every other. It's a unique adaptation. We have evolved at some point to depend on having our food cooked. We know very little at the moment about how to answer this question. Why can't humans use raw food as effectively as every other species? We do know that we have the smallest teeth of any of the primates, and we have the smallest intestines of any of the primates. Those appear to be adaptations that we gained once we were able to have reliable access to cooked food. And I think there's going to be a really exciting chase over the next decade and more to understand the physiological differences that commit us to this particular way of life. What is it about cooked food that's better? The bear is right to say he'd prefer to have the garbage, because the garbage is going to be human cooked food. And it turns out that we now know that cooking increases the amount of energy you get out of your food, partly because it increases the proportion of the molecules that are actually digestible, and partly because if you eat cooked food, then the cost of your body to digest it are reduced. Other animals haven't got there. Only we. So when did we adapt to cooked food? Well, we can look at some of these features of the species of the past. And we can say that the time when our teeth became relatively small was with the evolution of Homo erectus. And the time when our guts became small, to judge from the reduced flaring of the ribs and the narrower pelvis, was with the evolution of Homo erectus. So archaeologists are very challenged by this notion, because they can't find evidence of fire, and it'll be an interesting debate over the next few years, but it seems to me the biology points us very squarely to say that the time when we evolved to be different from every other species, when we became human, was 1.9 million years ago. Nowadays, the size of the human brain is such that it consumes an enormous amount of our basal metabolism, more than 20%. More than a fifth of every hamburger you eat goes to servicing your brain. And it's worse if you are a baby. How is it that humans uniquely are able to divert so much energy to their brains? I think the answer comes from fire. As a result of having our cooked food, we have adapted to being able to have small guts because the food is kind of pre-digested. And because we don't put so much energy into our guts, we can divert it off to brains, as happens in other primates. But we have the smallest guts of all, we have the largest brains of all. And then, if we wanted to chew enough food to supply our brains with the glucose they need, it has been calculated by a Brazilian team that humans would have to chew for 10.5 hours a day if we ate our food raw. If we were a great ape eating our food raw, or with the same size brain as a great ape, we'd be chewing our food for more than 6 hours a day. As it is, whether we're living in a subsistence society or wherever, we chew our food for less than an hour a day, which means that we can be human. We can write poetry, compose music, and do all sorts of things that other animals can't because they're too busy chewing. So that's why I think that fire was the initial impetus that enabled humans to slowly accumulate the thing that makes us really special. So what does it mean to be human? I think it means that we have been given the spark of life. And it is interesting to reflect that this is not just a question of understanding a little better about human origins and what makes us different from other species, but it's worth noting that what has given us our brains is cooking, and that means that we have depended absolutely on the fuel provided by other species, which is not true for any other species. And that dependence on fuel is something that is built into our biology, which is something worth thinking about as we start increasingly running out of the fuels of the past and think about the fuels of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wrangham. Our next speaker is Maestro Julius Williams, who is a professor of composition at the Berklee College of Music. He's a prolific composer, and Maestro Williams has created dozens of works for virtually every genre of contemporary classical music, contemporary music, including classical performance, opera, ballet, orchestra, chamber ensemble, chorus, and solo voice, dance, musical theater, and film. And he's also had conducting appearances with the orchestras of Dallas, Hartford, Akron, Vermont, Sacramento, Washington, and a range of other venues. So we welcome you, Professor Julius Williams.
Hi, everyone. I'm not used to talking in a program on biology or human experience, or I'm usually talking about chord changes and musical line and emotion. So I'm going to try to do the best I can to give you an idea of what is human in what I do. What's human with what I do is I drop papers and that kind of thing. I'm so used to, it's so easy for me to get in front of, 2,000 people in front of a symphony orchestra and wave my hand, but it's different when I'm talking, I'm out of my element. But I'm going to try to give you a little view into what I do and why it's connected to the human experience. I want to thank the provost and Dr. Langley for inviting me, and the Honors College. This is wonderful. What does it mean to be human? A statement very kind of apropos to musicians, composers, conductors, and artists in general. It resonates in the eye, mind, and eyes of every musician. To be human is a question ever present in all musical circles, from the west to the east. We all know that animals are able to communicate with each other. Birds are singing, cats are purring, dolphins communicate, but only a human can convey the different musical textures of sound and rhythm to be archived, to be enjoyed throughout many different generations. Music paves the way in our lives and paints our thoughts, channeling religious and sacred moments and identities, soothing the heart and the soul ever present in all societies. Music can paint a picture and can transport us through historical and emotional events, providing solace during trials and tribulations, providing us with future ideas, and is constantly produced by the world's artists, composers, and writers from every corner of the globe, presenting that proprietary idea of the human experience. Music is truly the sound of humanity. A question a lot of my students ask by many different composers from different backgrounds and cultures. That question we are debating. What does it mean to be human? And I brought it up in my class because I was trying to get ideas yesterday. We hear this statement very often. It's a deceptively defined concept in works of even my own compositions. I am sure there's not a work, small or large, which does not describe some aspect of our humanism. As a composer and conductor, I have been debating the phenomenon. Does my music reflect my humanity? Does it show that I am human with all the flaws and cracks of my personality? And believe you me, I have a lot of flaws and cracks. I constantly ask myself, will my soul shine through my music? I like to read some quotes. We always read every speech I give. I must have gotten, 3 or 4 honorary doctorates, and I bring up these same quotes, but I brought them back again for this, and which kind of fits into this whole story of what it is to be human. We go back to Plato. Music is a moral law. It gives us it guides soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, a charm and gaiety to life and to everything. The great Ray Charles says, I was born with music inside me. Music was one of my parts, like my rib, my kidney, my liver, my heart, like my blood. It was a force already within me when I arrived on the scene. It was a necessity for me like food or water. So these quotes are describing their human experience and why music flows through them. Ricardo Muti recently, who is director of the Chicago Symphony, talked about acts of violence, social political disturbances in the world, as signs of a society that's becoming more aggressive, a society without values. He said, "Great music may not offer a panacea, but it can provide spiritual balm to suffering humanity." He also said, "At a time when the world is full of bloodshed, society must have the courage to say that one of the weapons we have to make people's souls gentler and more harmonious is music. We have to make a start. Music teaches us to live in consonanza, which means consonance, in a world filled dissonanza, dissonance, in which every composer knows that if you have a lot of dissonance, consonance is a new mecca or place. If you have a lot of consonants, you put dissonance, and somebody would say, what's that? So it gives us a whole idea of what is constant ebb and flow in society. Marin Aesop, the music director of the Baltimore Symphony, talked about the great composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein, composition Kaddish. She says, "For Bernstein, the crisis of the 20th century was a crisis of faith. What can we believe in when mankind has the desire and capability to destroy itself?" He conveys this crisis musically by pitting atonality against tonality. For Bernstein, a tonality captured the musical end of civilization. Finally, Benjamin Britten, it is cruel, you know, that music should be so beautiful. It has the beauty of loneliness, of pain, of strength, and freedom. The beauty of disappointment and never satisfied love. The cruel beauty of nature and everlasting beauty of monotony. These composers, conductors, and artists all say one thing. Music is an essential part of humanity. In essence, it is what makes us who we are. It defines us as human beings. Without an oversimplification, music is a scientific oddity, a collection of electronic rhythmic pulses and sounds organized through the air with pulses flowing through our ear canal, creating a synthetic flow to our body. It generates some type of reaction in us, whether playing, singing, dancing, or just listening and experiencing. I wrote a composition describing the humanity and inhumanity that took place on September 11, 2001. It is an attempt to give the human experience through musical sound, some harsh, some anguish, some sadness, and questions of what to do next. What I would like to do is play a little bit of that to give you an kind of idea of what I was trying to describe in humanity. So I'm going to try to find it in the middle and give you a various idea, and I'm have Megan help me here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, come on, Julius. I don't even know my password. Can we get it? Give you an idea, it's waved in the back, but what I'm describing is the sound of the buildings going down and then the emotional after of what went on. So if you can, it's hard to hear, so. hard to hear a lot of it, but it was the idea of giving you a sense of movement happening, the idea of then it stops and people look around, you hear you hear the strings playing, kind of beautiful melody, and then you hear the horn crying, and the horn is playing at the highest note that it can play on the instrument, so it's giving you that sense. And underneath you hear the dissonance and the atonality in the lower basses to give that kind of question. So music does have composers always looking to see if it can create that emotional idea and effect. I just came upon something this afternoon. Actually, it's kind of funny. I was reading in in one of these magazines, and they said that jazz helps a lot of things. And I was trying to figure out what, and I started to read the article, and let me tell you what it says. Listen to jazz can make your food taste better. The genre and background music can affect how satisfying something tastes, and so may impact on how much is eaten. Research reveals, a researcher from the University of Arkansas played 4 types of music: classical, jazz, hip hop, and rock, while people ate. Participants found the food more satisfying when jazz was played and less so when hip-hop was in the background. I better not tell it to certain people I know. There was no effect for rock or classical music, so there's a problem I have already with this study. People often consume food and beverages in the presence of background music. Nevertheless, little attention has been paid to the influence of sound on sensory perception and perception of foods. Researchers said the reason why jazz and hip hop had such an effect was unclear. I know why, but anyway, I won't say. Okay, finally, I want to just, in my conclusion, I always like to read something that Maya Angelou writes, which fits about our 20th century idea of humanism and being human. She says, find a beautiful piece of art. If you fall in love with Van Gogh or Matisse or John Oliver Killens, or if you fall in love with the music of Coltrane, the music of Aretha Franklin, or the music of Chopin, find some beautiful art and admire it, and realize that was created by human beings, just like you, no more human, no less. Thank you.
Thank you, Maestro Williams, and thank you for playing us one of your compositions. It was lovely. Our third speaker this afternoon is Dr. Lynn Andrea Stein, who is a professor of computer and cognitive science and director of the Initiative for Innovation in Engineering Education at the Olin College of Engineering. Dr. Stein's research spans the fields of artificial intelligence, programming languages, and engineering and computer science education. She is a co-author of the foundational documents of the semantic web, and she is the mother of a humanoid robot and an intelligent room. Welcome, Dr. Stein.
Thank you. So I feel like my role today is to be the contrarian. So thank you to Vice Chancellor, Provost, distinguished guests and colleagues and inspiring students for having me here to speak about what is uniquely human and perhaps also about what is not. I believe fervently that humans are those who are inspired by the kind of musical experience or devastated by the kinds of real-world experiences that we heard about. That humans are those who inspire us by speaking or worry about ways in which things have gone wrong, who ponder the questions of the universe. My field is artificial intelligence. And because that's my chosen discipline, I strive both to understand how humans work and to think about how we can build tools to help us to work better. And in doing that, I find myself increasingly struck by how we are a part of a continuum. While we are unique, we are not completely unlike others. We heard earlier about how humans evolved from animals and perhaps what some of the critical steps on those paths might be. In addition to having a background in computer science, I sometimes fancy myself a bit of an applied philosopher. And so the journey I hope to take you on this afternoon is really in pondering the question of what it is that makes us human and whether we are in fact part of that larger continuum. If I had a title for the talk, it would be Making Humanity. So I hope that gives you a hint as to where we might go, though maybe not in quite the ways you might expect. As I said, my field is artificial intelligence, and part of that means striving to build systems that essentially replicate the intelligence of humanity. And part of that means building tools to augment. For example, Google, which is based on a set of technologies that once upon a time were called AI, artificial intelligence, but now it's just search and it just works, because of course if it works, it's not really artificial intelligence. There are many other technologies, though, that bridge those two kinds of approaches that both help us to understand intelligence and maybe help us to augment. So how many of you have iPhones running Siri? Right, speech recognition and intelligent question answering, or intelligent question answering, what about Watson? And Watson, of course, the Jeopardy is the IBM project that won Jeopardy, but is increasingly being used as a back end for systems that might help us to solve many other more interesting problems than just how to beat the current Jeopardy champion. And building companions for people who may not be able to get out in the New England winter. We're familiar with people trapped in their homes by the weather. Having some sort of assistive agent that might be there in their homes. So these are all things that combine both increasing our capacity and understanding where we come from. And they're all things that we call artificial intelligence, but I want to underscore that I don't think what makes us human is solely intelligence. And what makes us human has to include our emotional aspects, our social aspects, our interaction, our common sense, not just logic. Hubert Dreyfus famously wrote a book in 1972 called What Computers Can't Do, in which he derided the state of artificial intelligence because it really was never going to accomplish anything. For example, it was never going to lead to a program that could even beat a chess player. We all know that that happened in fact, 25 years after he wrote that book. The first world chess champion came about. But logic, playing games, isn't really what makes us human. What makes us human, of course, requires an understanding of emotional content and interpersonal interaction. Maybe Watson's a little closer. Maybe the robots that we're beginning to build can interact with us in ways that support us emotionally. Maybe there are systems that we would be willing to accord some smidge of humanity. And there is really where I want to go, that idea that in order for us to accord humanity the notion of being even remotely like human, we need a system that we interact with, and it comes from us and not so much from the system, to call it human, or to even give it human properties. So, quick quiz. I'm assuming that many of you have seen the movie Star Wars and are familiar with two robots that occur throughout, whether you're of my generation and know the original Star Wars movies, or the newer generation. If you could take one as a companion, would you take R2-D2 or C-3PO? So R2? And C-3PO, that's a little more evenly split. What's interesting about that is R2-D2, as many of you know, is a robot that looks sort of like a trash can on wheels. Its communication is mostly limited to interesting chirps. C-3PO, on the other hand, is a humanoid robot. But it seems to many people that R2 is actually the more human of the robots, because R2 evokes an emotional connection that the humanoid but somewhat snooty C-3PO doesn't seem to bring out in us. And it turns out that real-world robots are no different. The fact that a robot has a human-like body is not typically what engages us. The fact that a robot interacts with us in an engaging way is what makes us accord it some sense of dignity and, in fact, it turns out, some sense of intelligence. A colleague of mine years ago built a robot that competed in a contest to do some search and rescue work with other much, much more sophisticated robots. In fact, his, at the time, 12-year-old son helped him to build the robot. And the robot was tall and gangly and looked sort of like a broomstick and banged into things, but it was adorable and endearing. And at the end of the contest, which other robots succeeded at, much more so than this one, they polled the audience to find out which robot they thought was the most intelligent. And the robot that was fast and adorable was the one that they were more willing to accord intelligence. This at a conference of artificial intelligence researchers. So the things that bring out our emotional responses are the things we treat as intelligent, we treat as human-like, we treat as worthy of our interaction. In fact, the sociologist Clifford Nass has written a book about experiments he's run in which he has computers ask you about their performance or the performance of another computer program. So you interact with the computer, and then at the end you take a survey. And it turns out that people are much kinder to the computer asking about itself than the computer asking about another computer, which exactly replicates the way in which humans interact with other humans. If I ask you to give me feedback on my performance, you will be much more generous than if I ask you to give me feedback on one of my colleagues' performances. Or rather said the other way, if you ask one of them, you'll be more honest about my performance. That is, we treat computers, robots, artificial systems, in some ways the way we would treat other human beings. We make them human. And by the way, this finding holds even if the people you're asking are computer scientists. So it's not about knowing, it's very much about creating humanity, making humanity, because of the way we interact. So let's imagine a time in the future when AI has succeeded and we can build systems that are much smarter than Siri and annoy you much less, or annoy you maybe only as much as your average teenager, for those of you who have the experience of parenting teenagers. And in this future, where we have systems that are not only intelligent, but also empathetic. Increasingly, AI researchers are looking at how to build artificially empathetic systems, systems that replicate the behavior of an emotional system. So if we had these systems, how could we tell? And Alan Turing, one of the pioneers of computer science and artificial intelligence, wrote in 1950 about something we have come to call the Turing test, a measure of intelligence by which if we interact with the computer system through, he was envisioning, I think, messages in envelopes, but we'll call it typewritten text, internet chat, instant messaging, and we interact simultaneously with a human being. If we can't tell which one's the computer, then that computer system must be, he said intelligent, but I think we would accord it a certain level of humanity. Interestingly, there is a project to replicate just this. It's called the Loebner Prize, and it's been run every few years for now 25 years or so. And there are computers that do reasonably well at this within limited domains. So this computer will only talk to you about sports. But there are computers that are pretty routinely mistaken for human-level intelligence. Equally interestingly, there are human participants in the Loebner competition who are mistaken for computers. So perhaps the judges would accord them less of a sense of humanity. But if we had these systems which really could replicate that performance, and maybe they were in C-3PO's body, and maybe they looked more like the people sitting around you, it's still the case the philosopher John Searle would say, but they're just simulating intelligence, emotion, right? They're not real. And the philosophers have a name for that. They call those zombies. So a zombie is not, in the philosophical sense, a flesh-eating, undead creature, but simply a creature who looks and acts like any person, who behaves in every way identically, including being moved by meaningful musical compositions, including being able to report on sensations. But the zombie lacks that critical thing that makes you human, which, depending on which philosopher you are or whether you're a theologian, might say it's the spirit, it's consciousness, it's the soul. But a zombie is otherwise undistinguishable from a person. So a zombie is just simulating being human. The problem with that is we can simulate the atmosphere and predict the behavior of the weather reasonably. We can simulate complex systems like the stock market. But what would it mean to simulate doing arithmetic? So if I add 2 and 2, there, I've got 4. If I simulate adding 2 and 2 and conclude 4, how is that different from doing it? And I want to put to you, as a sort of closing thought, that if we had zombies, if we had creatures that could behave indistinguishably from the ways in which we expect other humans to behave, not only would we be inclined to treat them as though they were human, but actually that being human might be more like mathematics, in that doing it is not something you can simulate. You can do it badly. Computers today do being human really badly. But if we really had computers or robots that could be human in every behavioral sense, that it's actually not meaningful to talk about them as simulating. So I meant to start the conversation by asking you to look around and think about what made the people around you human. And what I want to end by suggesting that at some point in the future, there will be continuity between the kinds of devices that annoy us now and the kinds of teenagers who, and that, in fact, what makes us human is that ability to attribute humanity to those around us and to interact with one another as humans. Either that, or you might want to worry if the person next to you starts nibbling on your finger. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. We will close our evening of wonderful commentary with Professor Lloyd Schwartz, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning music critic and poet, who has written extensively on the poet Elizabeth Bishop, but who also has created a number of his own wonderful poems. And it's a surprise as to which one he's going to read to us today. We talked a great deal about it. He is the Frederick S. Troy Distinguished Professor of English and a dear colleague, and I invite you, Professor Schwartz.
Thank you. Professor Langley, Provost Langley, Terry, Rajani, thank you so much for inviting me. and thank our distinguished visitors for such stimulating and really illuminating, challenging presentations. Well, when Professor Srikanth invited me to read a poem relating to the subject of what it means to be human, one particular poem leapt to mind, and it is a poem by Elizabeth Bishop, who was born in Worcester, Massachusetts, and who spent the last 10 years of her life in Boston and lived right across the harbor up until her death in 1979. In 1961, this isn't going to be a lecture, I promise you. In 1961, Elizabeth Bishop wrote an autobiographical story called The Country Mouse. And the last line of that story was, "Why was I a human being?" She never published that story. It was published after she died. But 10 years after she wrote the story, she wrote a poem that covered much of the same material of that story. And I would say that in a way, it's not a poem that answered that question so much as a poem that learned to ask that question in a more profound way. And that in a way, one of the kind of morals of this poem and the whole issue of the question, what does it mean to be human, has to do with human beings' ability to ask questions. In the waiting room. In Worcester, Massachusetts, I went with Aunt Consuelo to keep her dentist's appointment and sat and waited for her in the dentist's waiting room. It was winter. It got dark early. The waiting room was full of grown-up people, arctics and overcoats, lamps and magazines. My aunt was inside what seemed like a long time, and while I waited, I read the National Geographic. I could read and carefully studied the photographs. The inside of a volcano, black and full of ashes. Then it was spilling over in rivulets of fire. Osa and Martin Johnson dressed in riding breeches, laced boots, and pith helmets. A dead man slung on a pole. Long pig, the caption said. Babies with pointed heads wound round and round with string. Black, naked women with necks wound round and round with wire, like the necks of light bulbs. Their breasts were horrifying. I read it right straight through. I was too shy to stop. And then I looked at the cover, the yellow margins, the date. Suddenly, from inside came an oh of pain. Aunt Consuelo's voice, not very loud or long. I wasn't at all surprised. Even then, I knew she was a foolish, timid woman. I might have been embarrassed, but wasn't. What took me completely by surprise was that it was me, my voice in my mouth, without thinking at all, I was my foolish aunt. We were falling, our eyes glued to the cover of the National Geographic, February 1918. I said to myself, 3 days and you'll be 7 years old. I was saying it to stop the sensation of falling off the round, turning world into cold, blue-black space. But I felt, you are an I. You are an Elizabeth. You are one of them. Why should you be one too? I scarcely dared to look to see what it was I was. I gave a sidelong glance, I couldn't look any higher, at shadowy gray knees, trousers and skirts and boots, and different pairs of hands lying under the lamps. I knew that nothing stranger had ever happened, that nothing stranger could ever happen. Why should I be my aunt, or me, or anyone? What similarities, boots, hands, the family voice I felt in my throat, or even the National Geographic and those awful hanging breasts, held us all together, or made us all just one? How, I didn't know any word for it, how unlikely. How had I come to be here like them and overhear a cry of pain that could have got loud and worse, but hadn't? The waiting room was bright and too hot. I was sliding beneath a big black wave, another and another. Then I was back in it. The war was on. Outside in Worcester, Massachusetts, were night and slush and cold, and it was still the 5th of February, 1918. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. I'd like to invite our speakers up to the stools here for a session of Q&A. And I hope the stools are comfortable.
I have an audience mic for questions, so you can raise your hand. I'll bring the mic along to you. Questions?
Thank you, and thank the presenters for a very engaging, well, an illuminating presentation to all of us. But I wanted to know whether the first thesis on cooking may be seen as enabling of the other three claims.
Well, if the question is, does cooking enable intelligence, music, poetry? I think so, because our brains, with the attendant importance of the emotions, they have to come from somewhere, and we need an explanation that is rooted in wet reality. The wet reality of where energy comes from and how it is supplied. And so for me, all of the magic that we heard about ultimately comes from that reality, the kitchen.
I just want to add, with a lot of my former students working in the restaurants around in Boston, where they should be working in music, but I think cooking is very important to the musical world. It keeps us employed.
So we have a concept in artificial intelligence of a problem that's AI complete. If you could solve that problem, you would genuinely have created artificial intelligence. And I would like to suggest that the problem of both designing, but more importantly, appreciating a really tasty dish, if we could build a system that could do that, that could respond to the emotional content of a fabulous meal, that would be AI complete. We would really have solved the problem.
Other questions?
Thank you for being here to speak to us today. This question specifically is for Dr. Stein. On the subject of possibly like having companions, what do you think that would mean for society and just particular maybe people who with assisted living and such things like that?
That's a fabulous question. I believe that in the short term, we will increasingly have systems that help us in specific ways. We don't attribute the same things to them that we would to human companions, but already there are things like Siri, there are other systems that anticipate some of our needs, and there are a number of systems that people are building to be companions of sorts, particularly for homebound older adults. There are robotic pets. They're not quite as cute and fuzzy as the real kind, but they also don't require the same kind of care and feeding. I think ultimately, if what they do is they enable us to provide a level of support that we don't currently have the person power to do, that's fabulous. And if what they do is that they enable us to disconnect from one another, that's terrible. So my fervent hope is that as technology advances, that it will help us to do a better job of creating personal connections between people and not give us an excuse to be further separated.
It's wonderful to have this opportunity to think about what makes us uniquely human, and I enjoy thinking about it, and it reminds me that perhaps the dog and the cat and the chimpanzee don't have the same ability to what makes them think that they are chimpanzees or dogs or cats. But I wonder if sometimes the focus on what makes us uniquely human leads us to forget the ways in which we're not unique in the animal kingdom. And if we lose something in understanding what it means to be human when we forget that, if we think only about this evolutionary process that leads to these enlarged frontal lobes and these increased reasoning powers and this large brain that allows us to have these thoughts, we can forget the fact that we also have a limbic system, that we have emotions, as you are recognizing, and that, in fact, our brain evolved not only in relationship to cooking, but also in relationship to allowing us to engage with others and to maintain ties with others and to be social beings whose very success and evolution depended on interaction with others. And those social abilities, again, are supported by the same types of neural systems that allow dogs to like us, for heaven forbid, and that allow chimpanzees to get along in groups. And if we forget that, and we get too invested in what's so unique about the rational side of us, we fall into the trap identified so well by Tony Damasio in Descartes' error, that our reasoning doesn't get us anywhere without emotion, without feelings, without motivation that drives us to do one thing or another. And the point is, you know, what good do these other processes do if we don't realize that there are faster connections, more fundamental processes that are influencing us every time we have one of those uniquely human thoughts, and that they're intrinsically also related to how we relate to each other, and that we can't really understand what it is to be human if we don't think about what it means to be part of humanity.
Well, for me, that's a wonderful observation that entirely resonates with my familiarity with dogs and chimpanzees. It means that we need to open another honors college and have another day in which we ask, what is it that connects humans to the rest of the animal kingdom? But of course, even if we do think about our emotions as connecting us, it becomes very interesting to think about what is it about human emotions that are different from those of our close relatives, and thereby hang many tales. But of course, you know, the fact that many of us can sit quietly and appreciate through our imagination the observations and emotional connections created by talks is something that is, I think, still unique to humans.
In my field, you know, the emotion is in what we do, actually. I don't think of anything that we, as an artist or a musician or a composer, there has to be some type of emotional response. Composers try in the past maybe 20 years to write music where no emotional response has happened, but still they created an emotional response. What I find that is different, I can even talk a little bit about, is that if I'm conducting a symphony orchestra, it's not the music sometimes that sends the response. It's actually some sort of energy from the people around me that creates the response. A lot of times, it's not, I know what's going to go on before I even hear it. And, you know, we talk about that being a conductor. The emotional response is in collectively in whatever room you are in. And that takes so much from, it's so hard to see. It's something that you can't speak on, but it's something that is actually an intrinsic energy source. And I don't know how to explain it, but if I know when things are not moving right, I can look and see behind me. I can see on side of me. I can see what's around, but it's something that either we'll learn or there's things that we have not even explored yet. So humanity is much more different and much more the same, I think, than we even know it.
There's a question from the back here.
Hello, I'm Jasmine again. Thank you guys for being here. And I had a question for all of you, but more so directed at Dr. Stein. And it's on the comment of, if we create an artificial intelligence that's enough like us, then we could call it human because we attach humanity on people. But I wonder, if you create this artificial intelligence so well and put them in a room before they interact with us, would they contemplate their humanity alone? And furthermore, I feel what makes us human is that we are contemplating our humanity. Like, do chimps sit around saying, well, what does it mean to be a chimp, or what does it mean to be a frog? And it's open to all of you guys.
You're right about the chimp.
Have you asked them? So I certainly think that's a fabulous framing of what I understand to distinguish us from any other species I've interacted with, artificial or real. And I think the challenge is in trying to create something that emulates the kinds of humanity we have, to understand what it is that makes us question. I think that we're a very, very long way away from actually having technology that does that. I think we're much closer to having technology that does pieces of what we do. But I think saying technology will never is usually a bad bet. And to me, the interesting question is, what can we learn from the thought experiments of what it would take to do that? How do we understand why we question? And what does that tell us now? But I look forward with you to exploring that future.
Thank you all for your presentations today. I'm kind of going to build on a theme I've heard going around the room. Humanity seems to have a pull between two poles going on. Our intelligence helps us to survive on our own. We use our own smarts. We use our own intelligence to go off in independent directions. And yet we have this pull of community. How can we survive as individuals? I'd like you to address that. And I'd also like to find out if any of you have a comment or two about the movie Her, which is a very thought-provoking expose on directions toward movement of independence in interactions with computers that are becoming more and more human.
So the early days of artificial intelligence were focused on intelligence as the thing that distinguished humans, and logical smarts. So game playing was an early challenge for AI, both because AI has gotten very good at playing games, but more because it's become increasingly clear, as many of you have pointed out, that what makes us human is not our ability to think logically. In fact, that's actually something computers are better at than people. Following rules, being logical, pursuing things to their logical conclusion. We're actually really bad at that. What makes us human is actually, in many ways, the more emotional side, the more gut instinct side, and the more interpersonal interactive. And I don't think we say that just because we're always trying to distinguish humans, right? Humans use tools. Oh, wait, there are animals that use tools. Humans use language. Oh, wait, there are animals that use language. Humans domesticate other animals. Oh, wait, there's some ants that domesticate aphids. So we are always trying to distinguish ourselves, but I also believe that thinking of humans as logical is fundamentally wrong. We are so much more, or so much less, if you think logic is the be-all and end-all. And so I think you're absolutely right that we need to understand that well, and that to the extent we're able to create something that is human-like, it will be as much because of its interactions and its understanding or empathizing with things that are not factual and logical. And that's our current challenge.
Okay, so I'll pick up on the social question, social aspect of humans. The role of community. We've been celebrating community in Boston today because of Boston Strong and the response to the bombing. And that's a wonderful thing. It warms all our hearts. Everyone loves community. I will just give a sort of two-sided view of this. On the one hand, the ability to form social groups and to do things together and to have complementary interactions is a great thing about humans that is really special and facilitated by language and so on. On the other hand, I think you can read the evolution of the communal spirit in humans with a dark side as well. And the dark side is that community is frightening, because if you become the exception, then you are vulnerable. That is because humans can form conspiracies. That in a small group of 20 people living together in the bush, somebody says, I'm going to do things differently. And all of a sudden, they are characterized as the outcast, the witch. And they can be ostracized, exiled, or killed. There is capital punishment known among all the hunters and gatherers in every continent. And this seems to me to be an interesting sort of flip side to be aware of, that I think we can read the human past as having been favoring people who work together well by being very cruel to those who are different. And it's an angle that we should want to be very aware of, that tendency today.
Well, the flip side of the community that has brought Boston together is the reason we needed to be brought together. And that there is evil in the world, or at least some power of destruction, and we see it in the paper, in the newspapers, every day. Sometimes more appalling, sometimes only mildly irritating. We click our tongues. But that's also part of what it means to be human, and that's kind of horrifying.
I'm always struck when I go to different countries, and a lot of times I can't even speak the language, or I know very little of the language, how can I put it? The community is not there until there's some type of connection, or some type of any kind of connection. All of a sudden you see people differently. Differences is, I think, particularly is human. And as just mentioned, that if you see something different, it could be good, it could be bad, it could be dangerous, it could be many different aspects. But I discovered that when people see you in a different light and they understand, we are able to then create a community, as the word community. If you're here and there, we're two different communities, but just our presence, which is different than, I think, other species, just our presence will create a community which will give us a chance to think about who this person is and then give us some kind of value system. My greatest show, I used to watch Star Trek: The Next Generation, and they used to have Data, and Data always wished that, he had some type of emotion, and he would be able to do everything perfectly, but he had this one thing. I also think about Data is, if I'm thinking about Stravinsky's Petrushka, he has this little, this ugly puppet that's running after this other beautiful woman, and then there's the prince. Now the woman doesn't want Petrushka, but she wants the prince. And obviously, because a magician came around and gave them human emotions, and he really wanted this ballerina. And so he saw the prince and the ballerina dancing together, and he pulls out a knife and wants to stab them. And he goes after, they have a big fight, and obviously Petrushka dies. When I'm telling this, and then the magician comes back and he looks at them and he turns them back into puppets again. So the emotional aspect of it is gone. That always is a kind of picture of humanism. That is a picture of, right, we see what happens. Soon as we get some type of connection, then all of a sudden we don't know what to do or anything dramatic could happen. So this question is so intriguing to me, and actually I'm gonna do a little bit more study after this thing. You know, it has created such a thought process that I never thought before, so I want to thank you.
I want to thank you all very, very much for being here. I want to thank our speakers, Dr. Stein, Dr. Wrangham, Maestro Williams, Dr. Schwartz. Thank you very much. I will just end by asking you to come to an alumni reception in the Alumni Lounge on the second floor. We'll get to meet some of the old Honors College students and also sort of have a social gathering amongst ourselves. With cooked food. With cooked food. And I'll just sort of leave you all with a thought. I teach a course on literature and human rights, and my students are always sort of talking about, you know, what makes us human. And one of the things that we have been wrestling with and wondering about is the capacity for forgiveness, which is quite an extraordinarily human capacity. And I just sort of want us to remember that on a day like this, and it's something to keep in mind. And thank you very, very much.